thing around that was, well, how do people respond to all this? Our staff have been astonishing. And I'm sure this is similar to for many people's businesses in so many different walks of life. A really phlegmatic attitude has showed itself. People have been prepared to move very quickly, to change the stained glass attitudes of lifetimes, to do things in the exact opposite way from what they've always been used to doing, and just putting a smile on the face and getting on with it. And absolutely astonishing how much we've got out of that. Not only that, we found ourselves much closer to our staff and able to set up new types of communication. Here we are now doing a virtual seminar and virtual meetings and discussions with people over Zoom and whatever have just kind of become part of our lives. And it's astonishing how much that's enabled us to communicate with our staff. And then if you think about it, a bus driver is a very individualistic sort of person, works on their own, and suddenly we've discovered the way of actually talking to them. And that's been extremely interesting. So overall, it hasn't been half as bad from a personal point of view to individual people as you might expect. The other thing that's happened to us, of course, is amazingly and through fantastic good luck, the government is paying us to operate what we're operating. There's a thing called the COVID bus service support grant, and that is actually been paying our basic costs. So that's kept our business going. And they're just about to come out, the government, with a CBSSG restart, which is going to keep us going for the next bit, because they've asked us to ramp up our service to make our frequencies much greater, back to almost normal, at least during the working week. And we're just waiting for them to hit the button. I wish they'd actually decide, because whether they want us to start on Sunday, this Sunday, 24th, or the week after the 31st, is a moot point at the moment. And if it's the 24th, they're not giving us much notice. But then that's the way the government seems to be working at the moment, pretty short term. So that keeps our business kind of on the ground. And that restart, incidentally, will involve us bringing quite a lot of people back off furlough and getting buses that have been sawned. If you've never sawned your car, you'll know it's quite a process, but we spent £1 million on tax across the UK on bus retaxing last Friday to get buses back into operation. Of course, the thing that's different now is social distancing. We all keep each other at a great space, and that's never truer than on the bus. And so our buses, where they've been marked up, they've just been done this week, only have about 20 seats available on a 75-seater, not much actual capacity. So that's very challenging. We actually do need people to stay at home, not to use public transport or to go to work some other way. And so where's that going to take us? It's very difficult to see how we'll ever get back to the sort of business we had before. People have changed. People like working from home, and quite a lot of employers will like the cheapness of having people working from home too. People have discovered their bicycles. They've discovered Shanks's pony. It's likely that the whole network will feel and look different at the end of all this. So will we have a business? Will there be a commercial business? Will we be able to make money out of running buses, as we have done for many, many years? The answer, I think, is we probably won't. And I think it will look a very great deal different from a business point of view, and a complete new business model will be needed. And if society wants public transport, it's going to have to pay for it. And that's a very interesting change of direction and requires a lot of political drive. Meanwhile, incidentally, we've been thinking about how we can manage the fact that our buses have shrunk so much. So we're looking to steal some of the thinking behind Uber type booking services and transfer them to buses, so that we can actually offer people the opportunity to book a seat on a particular bus ride, so that they get home. Well, that's all in the making. It hasn't actually come out yet, but it will do. It's all indicative of how things have turned on their head. And by way of sort of conclusion of these remarks, what I would say is that how the world has turned inside out. I don't know whether any of you in the audience work in the tobacco industry, but if you do, I'm beginning to understand how you might feel. We have a product which the government tells you not to use and which people are frightened of using. And that's how we make our living. And that is actually a really strange place to be. And when I got Moore talked about my PCV driver's license. I've had it since 1978 in my back pocket. It's always been an insurance for me. I've always thought I'd get a job if I ever needed it as a bus driver. Today, nobody wants bus drivers, no job for me. So we've got to go on doing what we're doing the best we can. But is it different? Boy, is it different. And it will never be the same again. And I think that's true of many things in society. A lot of things are going to look a lot different when we come out of the tunnel. So that's my 20 minutes, been and gone, all bar a second or two. And all I can say is thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to say these few words.
James, you've managed to pack an awful lot into your opening remarks. Thank you so much indeed. I'm just looking out to see if anybody's got an opening question. While I'm waiting, maybe I'll just get the ball rolling by asking you to say a little bit more about your relationship with government. You talked on the one hand about the marvelous support system that the government has put in place for public transport. So you kind of, I suppose, effectively government owned for the time being, or they're the purchaser of last resort, or however you want to call it. On the other hand, the kind of frustrations of their decision making is a bit lastminute.com. So the plans and preparations that you need to put in place can be quite frustrating. Do you want to just say a little bit more about that relationship with government? And maybe I'll embellish the question by saying, and do they have an agenda for public transport in the new normal that you can perceive or that you can influence?
Well, that's an interesting, two quite different things going on there. Yeah. The first one, how do we communicate with central government? We do it through the Confederation of Passenger Transport, which is the sort of trade body. The 5 major bus groups, of which First is one of them, are major contributors. So we get to talk to ministers in the Department for Transport. And they in turn negotiate with the Prime Minister's office. And that is where the fun starts, because as far as I can see, the Prime Minister's office runs at 100 miles an hour and doesn't always quite know which way it's running in. And so there are decisions one way and then another and then back the other way. And often things happen extremely quickly. One of the features of this whole coronavirus exercise for all of us in the whole, is the speed at which things evolved. At the beginning, it was quite amazing. There'd be a television broadcast at 7 o'clock in the evening, and by the following morning, everything was shut down. People had stopped doing whatever they were doing, and we were having to respond incredibly quickly. So the conversations are at a very high level. They are relayed to people, minions like me, who run just a bit small part of the bus operation on a very, very regular basis. And one of the interesting features for us has been a transformation in the relationship between the first group that we are part of, the big PLC, and the bus operating division, in that we have been able to get on and do what we needed to do and do it very, very rapidly. And that's actually enhanced the reputation of the bus division within the group, which is quite an interesting sidelight on that. But so we get pretty close to central government, and we get to see that they like us, are going this way for the first time. and that there are some interesting quick fixes going on just to respond to things that are happening. It's also interesting to see how the media sort of support has changed. At the beginning, the media were pretty supportive, but now it doesn't matter what happens, the media will always find a hole to pick in it, and 101 people to tell you why whatever it is that's just been decided is the wrong thing, it's completely misconceived, and dot, 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 dot. We haven't had that happen to us yet, but you do wonder when it might start happening in the local scene. So does the government have a strategy for transport? Well, there's an interesting question, and there's a big dilemma between the way the urban leaders, people like Mayor Marvin Rees and even Tim Bowles in the West of England Combined Authority, think about what's going to happen to transport in the area, and central government, where the messages are quite confused. In fairness, the Prime Minister said, and I heard him say it, get in your cars, folks. That might suit some people here, I don't know. But if everyone gets in their cars, we'll all go nowhere, I think, at peak times. So because the network simply hasn't got the resilience to cope with that. So you then come across, well, actually, hang on a minute. Active travel is, let's promote cycling and walking, but public transport. And the problem with public transport, of course, and it's just as true of the trains as it is of our buses, is that social distancing renders it not actually a particularly useful part of the mix at this stage. It's lost a lot of its big, its USP was mass transit, moving people efficiently, quickly. Suddenly, we're moving much smaller numbers of people, and that's a very, very scary place to be sitting. If you're sitting in a chair like mine, we are completely dependent now on central government wanting to continue to fund the provision of local bus services. If that were to change, our business would stop.
James, thank you for that. Now, look, the questions are beginning to flow, and I'm going to invite people to actually ask their own question, and I'm going to do them in this order to begin with. The first three would be Adam, who's got a dash at 2:30, so he's going to have to be quick, and then I'll go to Stuart and then Craig. Adam, ask your question.
Thanks very much, Muir. Hi, James. Thanks for your bird's eye view there. Really challenging times for everyone. It kind of links, I know this is a southwest call, but just with a West of England focus, given where you are, what do you think this does mean for integrated transport policy, where we're looking at relative metro bus and thinking about access to the airport, coupled with focus on more sustainable travel? Because now is also a time where I think we're going to be talking more and more about over-tourism, where much of the conversations have been predicated on continual year-on-year growth, whereas now we're going to be reassessing visitor numbers and how we move people around our sub-region. What do you think are the questions that local leaders will be asking, taking all that into consideration?
Well, I think the first thing that people will be worrying about is how to keep enough of the old stuff there that it's possible to pick it up again afterwards. In other words, that the dials don't all go back to zero and you have to start all over again. So, and I'd like to think that's one of the reasons why the government is willing to continue funding public transport provision to stop it literally disappearing. I think in the longer term, it probably makes the case all the more strong for integrated public transport provision. I think the public response to the peace, the I can hear the birds singing, all that stuff, seems to speak against just letting the car rip and a laissez-faire approach to all this. So you can imagine that once we get back into something normal, we're going to have to pick up and get going again. And maybe people will be prepared to accept things that they previously weren't prepared to accept. And it's very interesting that even before the lockdown, we were beginning to get public opinion getting to hardened politicians, and I mean hardened to the car politicians, and beginning to make them wonder whether actually it isn't good policy to make sure that the system flows well enough for public transport to work. So I think that how people respond to this whole coronavirus thing will actually make a difference to to what our leaders do at the end of it. And it all depends really how long it is before we get the chance to start to look out beyond. Because at the moment, nobody's looking beyond. And you can't really, because I just don't know what's the time frame for, who can tell us when this is going to end?
Okay, thanks, Adam. Stuart, you're up next. You pricked up your ears to the Uber reference.
Well, I did, yeah. Thank you, Mia. I suppose a very quick question to James was around whether this is an opportunity to refresh or look again at the actual infrastructure business model that you've got for running a bus company across the region, and whether, years ago in some of the local rural areas, we used to have very small buses, and is there an opportunity to effectively look at the green agenda as well in terms of reducing the carbon footprint, whilst refreshing the fleet and make a more agile and perhaps leaner business model to survive into the future? I just wondered what your thoughts were on that approach.
Well, I think that all bets are off, aren't they? And therefore that means that we can look at things in a slightly different way to the way we did before. And one of the issues will be sustainability in two ways. One is the green side that you mentioned in terms of bringing forward vehicles that are really clean in terms of emissions and so on, but also sustainability in terms of how can they be paid for, and who wants to pay for them. I think that's a major thing. And here we do have a dilemma, because society's got used to the fact that up until very recently, March in fact, 97% of the bus network in Bristol was paid for by the user, quite straightforwardly paying us fares. And all of a sudden, that's going to be different. And that's already out of line with what happens in the out of urban areas. So in the rural areas where the public transport offer is much more coarse, it tends to be now confined to the main roads, and otherwise between the main roads there's very, very little, very few bus services, and they are very, very poorly used. So different approach to them is crying out to come into place, some sort of demand responsive approach. But the problem with demand responsive transport so far is that nobody that I know of has managed to make money. So that means it has to be a matter of public policy to support it. Fine if the politicians want to do that. Fine if they've got enough money. One of the things that strikes me about this whole COVID-19 thing is we're spending money like it's going out of fashion. Some of it's coming to me, thank goodness. But are we going to have any money at the end of this to support anything? This is going to be a country severely indebted, and looking at a sort of 1946 type economy rather than what we had at 2020 March the 5th. So I think there'll be some very interesting questions to ask, and it'll all depend on whether the general public is prepared to stomach the sorts of costs which would be implied by doing anything imaginative in the grand scale.
Yeah, breaking the magic of the magic money tree there for a minute, James. So I think Craig is up next, and then I'll come to Patrick and then Simon. Craig, over to you.
Hello, James. It's Craig Bailey here.
Hello, Craig.
How are you?
Good, yes.
Well, sounds like we know each other.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been naughty here because I've got to dip out shortly, so I've now got two questions. One, just as a result of what previously said. My daughter's up in Sheffield at university, and I've been spending quite a while, and James, this will freak you out slightly, trying to encourage her to pass the driving test. She's doing a degree in journalism, and her response to that is, well, living in the cities, you don't need a car. You can use the buses. And with contactless introduced and the ease of using the bus, the younger audience who will naturally get older in time, I think it's a message somehow to get through to the government that actually there has been a sizable shift in perception of buses, because the bus industry have invested into the urban areas, of the ease of using public transport. And the first question is how that message, all that great work that's been done, because when I was a youngster, the first thing I wanted to do was pass my driving test at the age of 18. But now, university students, for example, are so used to that infrastructure. to reduce it because of costs, and how does that message get through to the government and it doesn't get lost in the midst of COVID? And then the next question is sort of linked, is with the government in effect paying for bus and rail services across the UK, the whole of the UK transport system has been renationalised for the short term. And when you've got the likes of Andy Burnham going, I want to franchise everything, how do we avoid, which I'm totally against myself, how do we avoid, for better words, feeding the beast of the franchise model and people just thinking about the here and now?
Wow,
So,
thanks for that, Craig.
I suppose if I take them in the opposite order from the way you picked them up, I'm sure that going forward, we're going to need public support for all of this, and therefore the business model will include an element of public sector direction. My hope is that is done on a participative basis, that is to say, and certainly the WACA man, West of England, is keen to do this, to continue to allow organisations like mine to have a part in deciding what happens, because actually we have some idea of what's going on and hopefully can contribute something to the direction. But equally, he who pays the piper calls the tune, and I think we must expect more public involvement. Now we've got to be careful of that, because we don't want to lumber everything with a setup which is not very agile and not very clever. But nonetheless, I can't see any way around changing the business model so that, or else we wouldn't want necessarily to see a straight franchise approach, because I think that removes the ability of the people like us to contribute anything other than just cost reduction. I mean, that's not a bad thing in itself. So what we're looking for is some kind of partnership arrangement that kind of gets the best of both worlds. In terms of how do we keep the message, the flags flying, well, we're working, and we continue to work very, very strongly with the local authorities here, West England Command Authority, Bristol City Council, Bath and North East Somerset, and so on, to keep them, keep close to them, really, because they do actually want public transport to continue, because they know that they cannot provide for people's mobility by simply making room for the cars. There just isn't going to be room for the cars, and therefore they need to think of different ways. So public transport sits in there, I think, and if it didn't, we wouldn't be seeing the sorts of support we're getting up to now. I mean, basically, we're being paid to run empty buses around at this stage. I hope they're not empty for long, but that's all about keeping faith with it. So I think there is an element of what I would describe as realism, others might describe as altruism, around getting the message, keeping faith with the people who have made the decision to use public transport, to use their own legs, and cycle and do all those sorts of things. So and I mean, the growth in public transport use in the West of England over the last few years is testament to the fact that people have actually been doing that, and I don't think they will necessarily want to desert it either. But we have to keep the service out there for those people.
Thanks very much, Craig. Big beefy question, and Patrick is going to follow up from that. He's impressed by the innovations you've been driving. Patrick, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you also for allowing me to gate crash your West of England Institute of Directors meeting. As a South East man, I've followed James throughout my career in the industry, and seen him at the forefront of so many innovations in our industry. So he's a voice I always like to tune into when I can and hear what he's thinking. So particularly useful at a time as challenging as it is now for all of us in the industry. Before COVID, we had lots of, probably more focus on the bus industry from government than ever in my lifetime, and lots of funding appearing to come our way too. How much of that remains after we've finished fighting COVID to filter back through to us remains to be seen. But part of the COVID tackling is about the reallocation of road space. And that's something that James and I will have been arguing for a long time because of the severe congestion that our buses are encountering. Certainly in Brighton, I'm sure it'll be the same in Bath and Bristol too, but journeys are taking 40% longer than they were 10 years ago. So it's close to being broken without that being addressed. The focus now on making more highway space available for walking and cycling is encouraging because people need to be more active. But bus passengers are really active travellers too. So I definitely think we need to be in on the conversations now about temporary reallocation of road space. And I believe strongly that once the messaging wobbles that are going on at the moment about public transport use and the ease of movements have been eased again, that the bus will be a vital part of the toolkit to ensure that we can build back better. I just wanted to hear James's view on that.
Right,
well, I mean, there have been some really scary stories in Liverpool in particular, and other places as well, of where the desire to make space available for cycles and walking has actually been at the expense of the buses. That's an easy answer in the short term, but it's extremely dangerous in the middle term. And I'm happy that in the local area, in the West of England area, politicians have understood that from get-go, and there are a series of plans going out now in the public domain in Bristol, which are all, thank goodness, sensible from our point of view, and add to the offer rather than detract from it. And in Bath, that there is some very interesting thinking going on as well. So, but I do think it's incumbent on people like me to spend a lot of time working with our politicians to make sure that they've got the answers available, so that actually they can see what the possibilities are. And you know, nobody's going to invest money, time, energy, anything else into provision of road space unless they think that's actually going to win them votes. Because that's the whole thing. That's always been our problem in the public transport business, which is that votes tend to go with cars in the eyes of politicians, in the perceptions of politicians. So when, as I say, voters start saying to politicians, actually, you need to do something that prioritises public transport on the street, I jump for joy, because that is a huge difference from where we've been before, and we have been seeing a bit of that in the West of England in the last 6 months. So I think steady as we go, and we have to keep on delivering. The whole point about all these things is we have to be able to offer sensible propositions. And there, I do feel at a disadvantage at the moment, because I turn out my bus and it's only got 20 seats on it, and that is dead scary.
Great question, great answer. There's more coming in here. So Simon, I think over to you, and then I'm going to go to Karen.
Yeah, hi James. It's just an observation where you were saying at the beginning, near the beginning of your talk. Can you foresee all buses, whether big double deckers or single deckers or even smaller, being fitted as you get onto the bus with a hand sanitizer, and also next to that hand sanitizer, maybe a paper mask container where you get on, you clean your hands, and you just take one of these masks, put it on, and then sit where you're allocated to sit?
That's, you mean as an alternative to the social distancing? That's interesting. I mean, we may come to that. I think it's interesting how the supplies of these various different comestibles have been a bit of a wrestling match. I mean, when we started the COVID-19, we couldn't get hand sanitizer, not for love nor money. Now we're drowning in the stuff. We've got absolutely gallons of it, thank goodness. But the same is true of face masks. Our first face mask supply at all ever in my whole career arrived on Saturday, so we're suddenly beginning to move into that area. And I think that behind your question is the sense that maybe the social distancing rules in the end simply don't make sense in some of these public transport connections. And And I mean, we've all seen the pictures of London where it's clearly an absurdity, just doesn't work. And to reduce the capacity in order to meet the rules is not possible, which is why they haven't been able to do it. In this part of the world, it is still possible at the moment because the numbers of people offering to travel are still, I mean, our patronage has gone from 8 to 9%. Wow. So at the moment, we're not under pressure, but we will have to think of things like that. I mean, interesting, I heard this morning, Greyhound coach lines in the United States, we've all heard of them, I guess, they equipped, because they were asked to do by the federal, I think, government, every single transit bus in the United States was fitted with a hand sanitizer dispenser, and within 2 days there wasn't a single one left. So they'd all gone completely. So that is a slight snag with that sort of approach, but nonetheless, I agree with the basis of your question, Simon, which is that I think we're going to have to think of some cleverer ways, aren't we? And otherwise, this is going to be silly. But I think we are all getting used to this, aren't we? We forget that we're only 9 weeks into this, and we've never had anything like this to learn from before. And we are, every week that goes by, what we accept and what we think about are changing. These things are changing. So we are becoming more prepared to do this or that, or not prepared to do the other. And so, yeah, goodness knows how this will evolve, but I'm sure it will evolve. And some of the absurdities will have to be worked out.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, it's the essential reassurance. It's psychological as well as the genuine health hazard management, and it leads into Karen's question. I think, Karen, over to you.
Well, I think actually Simon's kind of preempted what I was going to ask. Thanks, James. That was really fascinating. I at the top of the questions, wanted to ask you how you think you will be able to reinstill confidence in the public to get on a bus again. And interesting, you saying about Greyhound having their hand sanitizers stolen. Will we get to a norm where hand sanitizer on a bus becomes like a hand sanitizer as you enter a doctor's surgery or a hospital? So actually it will just become part of everyday life and people will not be stealing them anymore. I'm assuming that's what happened to them. They were nicked off the buses. So, you know, it's early days, but from a marketing perspective, which is kind of my background, you know, have you had any thoughts about how do you get people back on these buses short of physically, socially distancing them?
I thought you were going to say short of actually going out onto the streets and dragging them on, which might be quite a good way. I think this is a long job. And I think that the strange thing about COVID-19 is that it does bring into play something which we've never had to think about too much, really, which is fear. And there's still a lot of people out there who are frightened, profoundly frightened. Look at the discussion about restarting schools, for example, and you know, there are some people who are a bit more gung-ho than others, and there are others at the other end of the scale who are really, really scared of them, and they won't be unscared until somebody comes up with something like a vaccine or something that's going to be a game changer on this. And I suspect that, in a sense, until we've got to something like that, we're never really going to get out of the situation that we're in now, that people are a bit uncertain. Having said that, and going back to what Simon was talking about, it seems to me that what people will accept will change over time, and we may be able to do things that start to look more interesting and more attractive. One of the great big challenges for us is that we normally carry absolutely hundreds and thousands of university student journeys during the course of the year. Well, at the moment, the universities are currently, well, they're basically not really, no students are traveling anywhere. And we're all wondering what's going to happen in October when the next academic year starts. And I think actually so are the universities, from what I could gather. But, you know, it'll be very interesting to see if, I mean, talking to our friends at UE the day before yesterday, and that's just what they say, can't mean that. They were saying, well, there won't be as many students on campus, but there will be some. And the question will be, and some of them will be living in city centre, so how are they going to get to and from? And oh, well, there might be a couple of thousand of them. Well, at 20 passengers per vehicle, that's an awful lot of transit required to get them back and forth. So it'll be a question by then as to whether people have started to accustom themselves to these risks and as you might say, equip themselves with ways of defending them from the danger of the virus, and go from there. And really only when we've got over the fear bit can we set to work and get people back. And I think it's going to take years, literally years, to get back to anywhere near where we were on the 5th of March.
No, thanks, James. I'm just checking to see if anybody else wants to pop a question in here. It's open house, but I can always fill the silences. Anybody want to come in with another question? We've had a fabulous session so far. Okay, I mean, I was just going to observe, James, everyone, that it's kind of, as people's psychology tries to cope with how they're going to get out more, for some people the bus is kind of really the only option. Others have the luxury of other options, whether it's bicycle, Shanks's pony, as you say, or a car. But then some of us are kind of used to traveling by train or by plane, and you could argue the bus is much the lesser of those evils, if you like, if you sort of rank it in reverse order. So, there's room for the long distance bus to make a reappearance and be an alternative to perhaps to train travel. And I think one of the reasons I'm saying this is that I think people sort of feel more comfortable with a bus than it's a more open environment than say the closed environment of a train or a plane. Might that be something that the buses can be competing with those other modes?
One of the interesting things is that air conditioning is the new enemy.
Exactly.
And so I always wondered why it was that we never got around to putting air conditioning on our buses. And one of the advantages of that now is that actually you can open the windows, and that's one of the things that people say you should do. And indeed, I can imagine that a pressured cabin, or you can't open a window on a IEP train going to Paddington. That's a lot less comfortable. Mind you, you can't on a National Express coach either. So I don't know. I think there's a completely different question to answer about air travel. And I think that if there is a profound change that's going on in the transport world, it will be around air travel. Because I think people will come back to trains, and I hope we'll get them back to buses. But what will happen to air travel, I think, is a very interesting question, and it's a moot point which way it will go. Because I think a lot of people have stopped and thought about their carbon footprint, for example. And I think it will drive the air industry into thinking much more about its emissions. And Bristol Airport's very excited about electric aeroplanes. That sounds absurd, but electric buses were thought to be absurd not very long ago. So who knows? But I think that there are a lot of people out there who may actually think twice before they board another airplane. Although I guess there are an awful lot of others who, once they actually get the chance, will fly anyway, because they want to get to the place that they can get to by plane. But I think that's an example of how the world will look different from an environmental point of view. People are thinking about their green credentials, and that's what keeps me alive as a bus provider. That actually, we've got some pretty clean buses floating around out there. We've been doing a lot with biomethane in the last 6 months, and that is a carbon neutral operation from the bus point of view. So we have got some moral high ground in that area, and that might help us when we come to the great recovery.
James, thanks for concluding on that that very optimistic note. I think you've got an audience here of people who are really with you and have very much enjoyed the journey of the from middle of February through to now with you, and are rooting for you and wishing you well. I'm going to start wrapping up. I think at this point, having seen a lot of great questions, and those who've had to bow out early have very much enjoyed the conversation, and I'm delighted we've been able to make it a conversation. So can I have a sort of a virtual round of applause for James, and thank him so much for taking time out of delivering that essential public service. You've got a lot of supporters here, and we wish you all the very best in getting the show back on the road, in getting that conversation with the government, and taking full advantage of the crisis to help buses be better, greener, more abundant in our transport multimodal mix, as I think Craig was suggesting earlier. So thanks so much. It just leaves me to thank the home team and to welcome everybody back, hopefully in a week's time, for Carl. I think Carl's up, and Carl's on the line with us right now. So Carl, a director of Howard Tennans in Gloucester there, looking at transport again, also some big vehicles, but this time the logistics industry, which is going to be another fascinating insight into how another operation is keeping the show on the road, and so much I'm sure that we take for granted that's been running pretty seamlessly from my point of view since the crisis to now. And so Carl, who's a chartered director in our institute, and we congratulate Carl on getting his chartered status in the last few months. He's going to be speaking next Tuesday at 2. So do join us then. And thanks again to everybody for being with us. I can see you're enjoying the conversation. Looking forward to seeing you again next week. Stay safe.
Thank you very much, folks.
Say hello and keep smiling. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.